University. Thanks a lot for joining us today. This is our last event of this semester of our online meetings and presentations. Today, we have a very exciting event. We have several presenters involved. Presenting will be Marta Dechok, Andrey Kurkov, and Oksana Smith, and they'll be discussing the new book, Ukraine Calling, a Kaleidoscope from Hromadske Radio, 2016 to 2019. Now, this book is being printed as we speak. It should see the light of day in May 2021, so it's a very fresh topic. It's being published by German publisher Ibidem Press, and it's being distributed in North America by our own Columbia University Press. So we're very excited to be hosting, I think this is the first presentation of this book. In our event today, you'll get a chance to meet the creator of the radio program Ukraine Calling, which the book is based on that show. We'll have the chairperson of Hromadske Radio, who aired the podcast, and we will also have one of the show's hosts. The book itself is a collection of selected interviews that were aired on Hromadske Radio, public radio. And again, the name of the program was Ukraine Calling and existed between 2016 and 2019. Interestingly enough, the last program on Ukraine Calling was featured Oля Onuch, if I am correct, in I think it was July 2019. And 2 weeks ago, Oля was our latest guest on our series here. So kind of a coincidence there. The format for today's event, I will introduce each of our speakers and they'll have a chance to present in turn, and then we will open up the floor to questions. We wrap up around 1 o'clock, and you can write your questions. I'll read them out loud to our guests in a discussion period. So we will start with Marta Dechok. Marta Dechok is Associate Professor at the Departments of History and Political Science, Western University, Fellow at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs, and Adjunct Professor at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Her books include Ukraine's Euromaidan, Broadcasting Through Information Wars with Hromadske Radio, which was in 2016, Ukraine 20 Years After Independence, Assessments, Perspectives, Challenges, published in 2015, Media, Democracy, and Freedom, The Post-Communist Experience, 2009, and The Grand Alliance and Ukrainian Refugees, published in 2000. Her articles have been published in, among others, Europe, Asia Studies, Demokratizatsiya, and Canadian Slavonic Papers. She received her doctorate from Oxford University. She created, produced, and hosted Ukraine Calling. Welcome, Marta.
Thank you, Professor Andreychik, so much for hosting this, because as you mentioned, the book is about to appear, and I can't wait to see it, and all the more I can't wait to tell everybody about it. As you've heard, the book is a collection of interviews that aired on this show that I created, which was really a podcast that aired on Hromadske Radio. And I want to talk to you about the book. And Andrey Kurkov will tell you about Hromadske Radio, and Oksana will tell you a little bit more about the show. As an historian, I'm very aware of the importance of preserving primary sources. And as somebody who studies memory, I'm also very aware of how our perceptions of events change over time. That what we were thinking at the time events happened changes as we gain more information. And I first realized this when I was working on my doctorate at Oxford, which was about Ukrainian refugees. And I interviewed this elderly man, Pan Liman, in New York. And he was originally from Eastern Ukraine, from the Luhansk Oblast, if I remember correctly. And he ended up being a refugee in Germany and then made his way to New York. And as I was telling him or asking him about his experience, he was explaining to me how he had to flee the Soviet repatriation authorities because he was being threatened with forcible repatriation under the Yalta Agreement. And I thought, in the summer of 1945, you could not possibly have known about the Yalta Agreement because it was a secret agreement. This was something that he had learned about later, and that conflated on his memories. And so the way he remembered it 40 years later was he was running away from this secret Yalta Agreement. And this is what happens with most of us. As we learn more, our original memories, they get a little bit shifted. And that's why it's so important to have a record of what happened and what we were thinking at the time that it happened. And that's what this book is about, because these interviews were done 2016 to 2019 as things were evolving. And in this show that we created, that I brought together this international team of volunteers, so thank you. We picked the topic that was the hot topic of the week and invited one person or a few people to discuss what was happening. And these interviews really record not just what was happening, but what people were thinking at the time they were happening. And that creates an invaluable resource for us now and for future researchers. Because as I was getting the book together, and I'd like to give a big shout out to Dmytro Konovalov, whose idea it was to put these interviews in the form of a book. And also thank you very much to Professor Andreas Umland, who published the book. Because it's kind of an unusual book in the fact that it's not a classic academic book, it's a collection of primary sources. And as I started putting together the manuscript, people who were on our Ukraine Calling team were absolutely invaluable. So Oksana, who's with us today, Kathleen O'Hara, I hope you're with us, Larissa Yarovanko, we all sat down and looked at this because we did 124 episodes. That's a lot of episodes because it was a weekly show. And when the book contract finally arrived, I read all the fine print and it said 80,000 words. And Kathleen had put together all of the episodes in one big long document, and that was over 500,000 words. And so we had to narrow down what was going to make it into the book, because of course we couldn't include it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to publish. So the hard work of selecting began. So again, thank you, Oksana, Larissa, and Kathleen for the help with that. And the book starts with the first episode and ends with the last episode. So that frames the book. And then there are 28 other episodes within it. And each episode we carefully edited, because when you're doing a radio interview, people talk. But when you're reading, it has to read well. So there's a lot of work in editing. So again, thank you very much, Oksana, for that painstaking work. And if there are any mistakes, that's all my fault. So please don't blame anybody except me. Rereading all of those interviews a few years later for me was very interesting, because I had done a lot of those interviews. Oksana did some, Bogdan Mihailo, Marko Suprun, because we ended up having 4 hosts. So I was familiar with all of them, but even over like 2 years, I had forgotten what was being discussed in 2016, 17, and 18. One of the early interviews I did was with Brian Whitmore, who's a super Russia analyst, and he created the very successful Power Vertical podcast. And he actually taught me how to do a podcast because I'd never done this before. And in the summer of 2016, when I was interviewing him, he used this phrase that war is the new normal in Ukraine. And that, sadly, has not changed. So it was interesting to see that's what people were already thinking back then, and that's stayed the same. Another 2 interviews, and that interview is in the book. Another 2 interviews that, as we were editing, I decided to include in the book were about religion, because we did different topics in the show. And again, very early on in the show, I was in Kyiv at the time. I was walking downtown and I saw these 2 religious marches. And I thought, oh, this is a topic of the week. So we talked about politics of religion. And one of the people I interviewed was Professor Frank Sist. And Frank, I hope you're watching this. And he gave a really interesting interview about the role of religion in politics. And one of the key things he says is that religion changes slowly. The church moves slowly. I think that's the quote he used. And a few years later, we did another interview with another professor, Yaroslav Skira, and this was after Tomos had happened. And again, Tomos just kind of happened like this. And so we have this perspective that it looks like nothing's going to change, and yet suddenly something changed really quickly. There's also a series of interviews with sort of high-level people. So I think the most famous person in the book is Chrystia Freeland, and she's also in one of the early episodes because she was traveling with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and they were signing the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. There are also other interviews done with, one of my favorites is with Ambassador Nestor Gajowski, because sometimes there wasn't any news happening, so we would pick a feature topic. And on the anniversary of the referendum in 91, so it was a December interview, I reached out to Ambassador Gajowski. I hope you're watching, Nestor. And he gave me the backstory of how how Canada became the first Western country to recognize Ukraine's independence. So that was like a scoop, although it was kind of a history scoop, and that's also in the book. There's also interviews with so-called ordinary people. On the anniversary of the annexation of Crimea, Oksana did a really nice interview with Hennadii Afanasiev, who is a young man living in Crimea, went to a protest, got arrested, ended up in jail, was tortured into giving a false confession implicating Oleg Sentsov, and then in a very dramatic move recanted his confession during the trial, and then eventually was released in a prisoner exchange. And he gave a really good interview to Oksana. It's kind of harrowing because he describes all the torture that he experienced. So that's also in the book. We have an interview with a young military volunteer who ended up being a participant in the Invictus Games. There's also interviews with Timothy Snyder done by Bogdan Mihailo on the anniversary of the Babin Yar tragedy. Also a really nice interview with the writer Andrey Kurkov. So it's kind of, I called the book a kaleidoscope because it gives you a sense of what was happening, what people were thinking, what people were saying. And some of these interviews have already gained traction. One interview I've already used in my teaching by Yevhen Fedchenko, who is the head of the journalism school at Cave Hill Academy. And he gave a really interesting interview where he talked about the fact that Ukraine was the testing lab for Russia's information wars and cyber wars that they then expanded. So I've used that in my own teaching. And just 2 weeks ago, I was examining a PhD dissertation by a student from Cambridge University. And lo and behold, she's using that interview in her dissertation. So this is my hope for the book, that this collection of interviews will be used by people who want to know what happened in Ukraine and what people were thinking at the time. So buy the book and use it. And there's going to be an electronic version and a hard copy. In the electronic version, I've included the links to the actual episodes. So if you want to listen to the original interviews, you will be able to do so. And I think I've been talking for way too long, and we have 2 other really interesting people to get to. So thank you very much. And passing on mic.
Thank you, Marta. This is great, and I'm so happy you decided to take this snapshot. I think it's really important, like you said, because perceptions change, and I didn't realize there was going to be a digital version as well. I think that's fantastic. I can't wait to use it and I'll be teaching a course in contemporary literature next academic year. So perfect. I'll have it by then. So I'm looking forward to using it with my students. I forgot to mention that Marta has been a guest of Harriman many times, and back in 2013, helped to conceive a conference that we did on Ukrainian media. And our next guest was the keynote speaker at that conference, Andrey Kurkov. And I was actually watching, we have videotapes of parts of that conference up on our website. So if you want to see more of Marta and Andrey, then please do. Andrey Kurkov is the chairperson and co-founder of Hromadske Radio and the head of the Commission of Journalists' Ethics of Ukraine, one of the leading journalists in Ukraine. He has worked for News from Ukraine, BBC Radio in London, various Ukrainian TV channels, including Oden Plus Oden, 1+1, STB, and ICTV, where he hosted the award-winning political talk show Svoboda Slova, Freedom of Speech. A graduate of Cave University's Faculty of International Relations and Law, he has lectured at various Ukrainian and international universities, including Harvard, Columbia, Oxford, Toronto, and has supervised graduate students. So please, Andrey, unmute your microphone and welcome to the program. Andrey.
He looks frozen. Maybe his
Yeah,
connection's timed out.
looks like the screen has frozen. We have a bit of a delay. We'll let Andrey log back in. Yes. Oh, we have some movement.
Yes.
Good to have you back.
Yeah. I think that the Zoom was surprised to hear so much about myself. As usually, I most of all cherish the fact that I'm a co-founder of Hromadske Radio. When we founded the radio back in 2013, we were not thinking about having an English language or any other language apart from Ukrainian program on our waves. Actually, we were not even thinking about having waves, because at that time we were thinking about something like a podcast radio. We didn't have a studio, we didn't have equipment, so we were thinking we will record podcasts, put them online, and eventually, we will probably obtain a license and whatever, or permit, call it whatever you want. However, it all changed when the Revolution of Dignity began, and especially when I saw a couple of reports on Russian television about what was allegedly happening in Ukraine. And of course, this led to a desire to provide some information for our existing and prospective listeners in foreign languages. I remember that we had 2 or 3 podcasts in French. I did 2 interviews in Polish, but the most widespread and the easily accessible language in our version was English. So when I went to the Maidan, I did not only Ukrainian language reports, but also English language reports. They were done in walk and talk manner. Just what was around was easily put to a dictaphone through a mic, and then, of course, put online. I would not say that we had an immense audience following our English language or other foreign languages broadcasts or podcasts, but the interest was marked, and we looked then for a opportunity to put our English language podcasting or broadcasting on a regular basis, and then Dr. Duchok appeared. Well, actually, she appeared earlier because she was following our development, and of course developments in Ukraine, if not from the very beginning from the very inception of Hromadske Radio, then pretty soon she started to do this. But to have such a qualified or skilled person with knowledge of both Ukraine and the so-called Western world, which presumes also that she knows the psychology of the audience, the tastes of the audience, and the way you should formulate your material to reach the audience, was very welcome thing indeed. As many of us have known Dr. Duchok previously, before, because she used to be, and I hope she will again become, a noticeable person in Kiev scientific milieu and academia. So there was a general wow when we got to know that such a person will be taking direct part in our production. And of course, it was very helpful in the way that she knows the other half. We know And we think that this in Ukraine is important for us because we think from the, first of all, Ukrainian point of view. Well, again, she combines both points of view and she can put her finger spot on what is perceived as most appealing and most important at the moment for the Western audience. So we jumped at an opportunity to use her services, and very soon she has built up a potent team around her, and we were very, very much glad that she was with us. And of course, if asked about whether what Dr. Dechok did in her program was compatible with the editorial policy of Hromadske Radio, my immediate answer would be yes, although there was a very little level of coordination, as far as I know, between what she and her team did and what the general policy was. But when people who are who think not alike but in the same vein work in parallel or work together, you really do not often need a formal conference to decide that you should do this and this and this. It all goes sort of, to say, by default, or in Ukrainian, this is even more fitting expression, za umовчанням. You can be silent, but you understand each other perfectly well. So I think that we made a good use of Dr. Dechok's services. I think that she also gained from participating in Hromadske Radio's work, in particular because she met a lot of people, some of whom she wouldn't have met if not for the purposes of the program. And of course, she also was, I just sometimes watched with, not in awe, but with admiration, those people who helped Marta in her efforts. And a team within a team is a special phenomenon. You know, you gain from them, and at the same time you want to help them in their activities. So it was most informative, it was most educational, and I sometimes listened to those programs not just to improve my English, but in order to gain some information which I may have overlooked. So this program had an added value for me as an editor, as a reporter, and so on. So far, so good. I stop at this point.
Thank you very much, Andrey. Really interesting to see how it came to be formed under the umbrella of Hromadske Radio. Our third speaker, Oksana Smith, has a degree in linguistics from the University of Sydney, Australia. She was a researcher and fixer for CBC News and BBC Newsnight in Moscow in the last years of the USSR. And she co-hosted Ukraine Calling. Smetychuk then pioneered head of state-level Ukrainian English interpretation and translation for Canada. An active community organizer while living abroad, she has been president of the International Women's Club of Belgrade and president of the Kyiv Ambassadors Spouses Association. She now lives in Toronto and serves on the board of the youth empowerment charity Help Us Help. So welcome, Oksana. One of the show's hosts, give us your insight on what it was like hosting a program.
Thank you. I just have a few thoughts about what the experience was like making the program. So first of all, back in 2016, Marta approached me and asked for my help in making the program and trying to inspire me. She said, "You can make the podcast about anything you want." Well, perhaps I wasn't quite about anything we wanted, but it was definitely a bit of everything that was Ukraine related. Of course, it was all related to current events. It was very topical, but in a wide diversity of areas. Could have been about the politics of the day, could have been about business or arts or changes in religion or Ukrainian sports. So one of the constraints that we actually had to work with is it had to be recorded in the studio of Hromadske Radio. Here I am in downtown Kiev, but it's not so simple as taking your mic out into the streets and talking to people. So we had to record in the studio to ensure top sound quality. We had to talk with our guests to make sure they came into the studio. Another constraint was we needed good English speakers. You think you have there's this wealth of events out there. There's so much happening in Ukraine. There's so much variety, but you really need to select someone who will be able to speak freely and fluently on radio. Now, I know from personal experience that 30 or 20 years ago, this would have been a huge challenge to find Ukrainians who can speak about their country in a very convincing way. Having worked with delegations that used to come to Canada and vice versa, that we traveled to Ukraine, there wasn't so much active English speaking going on. And you really need to find speakers who can think in English, improvise in English. Now, when you think of other media, such as in TV, language is less of a barrier. So in TV, you can work with subtitles or a voiceover if your interviewee doesn't really speak, such fluent English. But in radio, in podcasts, having a good narrative voice, that's very important. Quite often I found that the newsmakers that I'd most wanted to have interviewed were, alas, not English speaking. So then you look for other angles. And I'd like to give you a little glimpse into the kitchen, so to speak. So the production cycle would usually take about a week. First we'd research the theme or the topic and see what was in the news. We'd find the right interviewee could be able to address some angle of these topics. Then the challenge of booking into the studio at a time when both the studio and the studio engineer were available, and then recording the interview. So then the news segments, you also had segments of topical news for that week and music segments, they would be prepared. So this would bring us to about midweek. Then we'd work with our team of volunteer transcribers, and the race was on to get everything finished and packaged for the Friday evening broadcast. Now, we weren't just preparing an audio broadcast or a podcast. We're at the same time, in parallel, we're preparing a written text which would go up on the website. And quite often that was a challenge to work with a transatlantic team of volunteers and to get everything ready on time. So the sound engineer would then send these the recorded interview track, and so we would allocate then the sections that the individual transcribers would work on. At one point, we had transcribers working in about 4 time zones, which needed to be coordinated. So this is Kiev, of course, Larissa in London in the UK, and then some transcribers in London, Ontario, in Saskatchewan, and we also had New York at one point. So the pieces would all be compiled and come together for a final edit by Marta in London, Ontario, on a Thursday evening, to be uploaded and broadcast on Friday evening by Hromadske Radio. Now, we had 4 hosts, as mentioned, 4 hosts leading the program. The first was Marta the Chalk, and I think that from the beginning, she was not just creating a very listenable 45 minutes of programming, but she also had the instincts of a historian at work. Well, both a journalist and a historian, very much aware of the who, the what, the when, the where, and the how. And at the same time, very informed of the background, of the historical background of the political events, and also at the same time thinking, as she mentioned, how this is going to be recorded for posterity. This is going to be a primary source in the future. Then also Markojo Soprun joined the team and took on the job of interview host. And he brought with him his experience as a filmmaker and film producer. I often have the feeling that he would be planning with a filmmaker's storyboard. Where is the drama in this story? Now, he'd be the one to set up, say, studio conversations with 3 guests who have 3 different opinions, the pros, the cons, and on the other hand. And he'd be the one who'd draw out very compelling narratives from his guests about his experience in the war in the Donbass region, or experiences in the information wars. And also then Bogdan Mihailo came along and made a major contribution as a radio host. Now he's someone who's a veteran radio broadcaster, many years of experience with Radio Liberty, experienced also in international organizations, in international politics, and also having a very smooth radio style. I guess he was the most omnivorous of us radio hosts. He could interview the most diverse personalities and be able to engage with each, whatever the topic, in politics, policy, defense, business, multilateralism, art, sport, and even very esoteric things, such as who knew that there was a connection between heavy metal, photography, and Ukraine. And I also contributed as a host for quite a few programs. I find it's hard to say something objectively about myself, but my vision when I was doing it was to record the authentic voices and the opinions of Ukrainians. Now, we did have a consistent group of political commentators and political scientists and analysts that we worked with. Just to mention a few names like Timothy Snyder, Adrian Karatnitsky, Mikhailo Vinitsky, Brian Whitmore, and others. But what bothered me is, in most cases, these were not Ukrainian nationals, but people from mainly English-speaking countries who were practiced in explaining the region and knew how to present Ukrainian events to the English-speaking world. And what I wanted, my vision was I wanted the voices of Ukrainians talking about their experiences and about their events as they happened. So hence you have interviews like with Pablo Mamontov, who was the athlete who, to his own surprise, he became an athlete who competed in the Invictus Games. Or Hennadii Afanasiev, the young man, as Marta mentioned, who was captured in Crimea and then held in Russian prisons, eventually released. But here hit the wall of reality that Ukraine has so many stories to tell, but only a certain percentage of people would have the fluent English to be able to tell you this in a podcast. So this is a goal I think we all can grow towards, more Ukrainians telling their story in English to the outside world and knowing how to tell the story. Now, as to wrap up, my recommendation is, yes, go buy the book. And when you read the book, there's a sort of dual track way to do this. Well, you have the written texts that are prepared, and in parallel, I would also recommend clicking on the links and listening to the audio texts. And to keep in mind that there are many other interviews on the Hromadske Radio Ukraine calling website, because only a third of what we had recorded actually was selected to go into this book. And sometimes we found that when we're actually working with the interviewer, we found that some of them were very live conversations. These type of interviews come across very well in the recorded text, but then once we were working with preparing the written texts for this book, we found, wow, there's such a wealth of information that some other speakers brought across that wasn't really coming across when you listen just to the audio. You really have to see the written text. So I think there's two elements there that you have to take in at the same time. But to conclude, I'd say it was a very interesting experience, both in helping to create the podcast, the interviews, and thank you for the privilege of being able to work on producing this final book. Thank you.
Thank you, Oksana. Yeah, I think it's very important, the idea that you mentioned, Ukrainians telling their stories in English so that these stories can get out to the world and access to these stories. I think that's one of the services that you provided with your program. I'd like to open up now our event to questions. Please send your questions and I'll read them to our participants. In the meantime, I guess I'll just throw them out to everyone, and whoever wants to answer can answer. But you mentioned at the end, Oksana, the interviews, and when I looked at Hromadske Radio's website, the English version, two words are used to translate Hromadske. It's community and public, right? And it kind of fits nicely because there seems to be two goals that Hromadske Radio claims that it wants to help in doing, and that is developing both Ukrainian communities and Ukrainian civic culture. My question is, how did you determine the format for your program, that it was going to be an interview as opposed to a different format, right? There are various kind of radio programs. How did you determine that an interview would be the best way to accomplish these two-pronged goals of developing Ukrainian communities and developing civic culture? Can anybody want to take?
I think I'll take that one because I came up with the idea. In the actual show, there were a number of components. And the reason I started this show is because I kept being asked by people what's going on in Ukraine, because there was so much going on. And those of us who are Ukraine watchers, we're up to speed on everything. So we can take a lot of information and synthesize it and give it to somebody in like a 5-minute or 30-minute soundbite. And there was nothing like that I could just point people to. So that's why I thought, okay, well, I'll do this. So the show, the actual show was news headlines. So for somebody who doesn't have time to follow what's going on in Ukraine every day, they can tune in on a Friday or Saturday, get caught up on all the news, and then have some in-depth commentary. And because I love culture, there was some news about culture and music. There was always music in the show. Mm-hmm. So that was the format. But for the book itself, what the news, you can find the news in news sources. So that didn't make it. The music, you can't actually put the music in a text. Mm-hmm. So we just focused on the interviews. So that's why how that sort of the thinking behind that. Mm-hmm. And as Andrey said, this was an opportunity for all of us to meet interesting people, but also a way to sort of explain what was happening, because the choice of theme of the week was driven by events. Mm-hmm. So like the first show, this is what Brian Whitmore said, pick a big story for your lead. And there was the NATO Summit happening. So that became the topic of the week, because that's what everybody was talking about. And it was the Ukrainian perspective on what was going on. And then another week, it was like the third show, we were struggling. I was struggling because I was by myself then thinking, what's the show going to be about? And then a terrible tragedy happened. Pablo was killed. Mm-hmm. And I was like, that's going to be the topic of the week. And so Enrique and Paul Nealand and Katya Smiley. So it sort of was like that. And then certain weeks when there wasn't a big story, then as Oksana said, there would be something on culture or something, so there was always something. And I think that was also an interesting part of the show. And I hope the book conveys it. So what's it like to be in a country that's on the receiving end of a war? Because there's a lot of news and there's a lot of politics, but there's also other stuff going on. Yeah. There's an episode, I can't remember if she made it into the book. Oksana did this interview with the director of Mistecki Arsenal. They continued having these book fairs, even though there's a war going on. And so it was kind of, the choice of topic depended on what was going on. Mm-hmm. So I hope that sort of answers the question. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in there.
Thanks, Marta. Did Andrey, you wanted to say something? Or yes, please.
Yeah, of course, I share what Marta says, but we should not avoid the issue of feasibility. And interview, production-wise, is a very feasible format, because you just record it, and if you don't go very much over the time limit, you don't have to do anything with the interview. That's why I think if Marta and Oksana and other presenters had a chance to produce, to be on live broadcast, then interviews would be even more pronounced. And the interviews would be a logical choice in this case. The issue of feasibility is very much at core of many things that we do. And for instance, I always tell younger colleagues or students, would-be colleagues, if you have a chance to go live, because you save on time, and in addition, you get a opportunity to talk to your audience, to answer phone calls, to read Viber or whatever messages. You get additional value in this, and the interviews are a logical choice. It was, I think, very wise and very feasible that this was done. And as far as music is concerned, I take pride in the fact that Dr. Dechuk very often consulted me on this issue. because I really think that Ukrainian music, mostly in the Ukrainian language, is a treasure that is underappreciated even within Ukraine, not to say about outside world.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to ask about the music, whose idea that was, because I know that Marta, sings in a choir, and
I
Andrey.
think that the idea came from Marta,
Mhm.
but as I run my own musical program regularly, I was again the logical point of contact for this. I don't say that she used or everything that I recommended, or I recommended everything that she used,
Mhm.
but this was a closely knit cooperation. As far as for community radio or public radio is concerned, I think that a more correct way would be to call us community radio, but it took us some time to understand this. Because when we were founded, we called ourselves in English public radio, although this also was used for translating suspilne,
Mhm.
radio, public radio. And it took us some time to realize that we are actually coming from the third sector of broadcasting,
Mhm.
not commercial or public, but community radio.
Mhm.
And it was very interesting that intuitively or instinctively we found the Ukrainian term which fits with community. Although now I think that we can even in Ukrainian think and use not Hromada but spilnota.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
but it is closer to Hromadske, to community and all this kind of stuff.
Yes, Hromadske is certainly something you'll stumble upon if studying Ukraine over centuries and contemporary times. Andrei, I remember when you spoke at Columbia last in 2013. Even though you were, a famous TV host, you had mentioned your fondness for radio at that time. What can you tell us about what advantage does radio have over TV? Why the fondness for radio over television?
Well, for me, radio is a logical platform on which public discussion may be organized easier and with more candid, what's the word, with more frankness
Mhm.
than on television. And it's much more personal than, for instance, the internet, and not as scary as television may be for the so-called average participants. It's much easier also to gain user-generated content on radio.
Mhm.
And I cherish those moments when people phone in. Sometimes they say awful things from my perspective, but this is an immediate reaction you get, and you may be sure that this is not a robot, but a real person, although they may be hiding their real names or telling us that they are in a different place then. So, looking at the countries which I term the developed democratic countries, like Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, the United States, with all the drawbacks that this kind of democracy has. I say that these are the societies where radio is revered, where it is listened to, and where it is recognized. So, in the society where democracy is being built, it is radio that, to my mind, is the most logical instrument for helping build this democracy. And for me, public discussion is one of the most efficient instruments or tools of building democracy. So this is my the reason for my being so fond of radio. Plus, of course, to me, radio poses more challenge as a producer than television does. You can go and film something, and when you show a throng of people, you don't have to say there is a throng of people or a crowd standing there. While on radio, you have to find words and intonation and a proper second when you want to say this. So,
Thank you. Very interesting. Oksana, do you want to add anything to any of those questions? Oh, I think you're still muted, Oksana. Yes. There you go.
Oh, but a bit later.
Okay. Well, we have about 10 minutes left. I want to remind our audiences that if you do want to ask a question, you're welcome to send it in through the chat, and I'll read these to you. I did have a question for you, Oksana, about a guest that you had. Have any of these interviews that you did over the years, did any of them go completely differently than you had expected? Like going in and coming out, or you just said like, wow, that was not what I expected. Anything like that, or in particular that you want to, maybe something you don't want to mention, but maybe it's something that you would like to mention?
Yes, well, one that comes to mind is with Hennadii Afanasiev, the young Ukrainian man who was an activist in Crimea and then was arrested by the Russians and held in prison. And I was expecting that this would be more of a conversation and I'd have to draw him out, but in fact, it was such a strong, I guess he had such strong experiences that he just had this narrative that just came out, and I was just simply listening to him with my jaw dropped. Then sometimes you'd have interviews where you would, another example of this, of a case when someone had just had their own narrative and you try to make it a conversation and you try to discuss, but somehow some people have a very strong sense of their own message, would be with the former Minister of Health, Oksana Smith. She had her message to tell, and I think Mateu was speaking with her, leading that interview. That came out as a sort of a testimonial to sort of the work that she was attempting to do and the reforms she was trying to make. And when you see the final written text in the book, you say, oh yes, that's spot on. That's what she really needed to get this message across.
Yeah, if I could just jump in there, because that was, Oksana Smith is somebody who did so many interesting things and such a powerful figure. So I was delighted when she agreed to come. And then instead of answering my questions, she just kept saying what she wanted to say. And I thought, whew, this is hard. And then like when I was listening to the interview, I thought, oh, this isn't going to be so interesting. And plus we had time constraints, right? Because like in my ideal world, I'm an academic. We talk for a long time, right? But in radio, you got to fit into the format. And so we had to like edit it out. And so the whole interview couldn't make it into there. And it was difficult. And again, with the editing with the book, but man, is that good material. Like it reads really, really well and a lot of really good detail. Because again, right now, Ukraine's like the world in the middle of a pandemic. And I was just listening to the current Minister of Health of Ukraine. I was like, oh my God, where's Ulyana? But that was an example of an interview that really is definitely worth reading. I mean, they're all worth reading, but that's an example of one that didn't go as planned. I have to tell you, actually, I don't know if there's too many other stories to tell about the. I got to tell you the story about Chrystia Freeland, because this is Andrey Kurkov. If you're listening, I hope you'll forgive me, but this was like very early on. This was episode 2, and this was when it was just me and him, and the topic was Canada's visit to Ukraine, Prime Minister. And so I was chasing Trudeau, but of course Trudeau's impossible to catch. So I got Chrystia Freeland because she was the Minister of Trade at the time, and Andrey Kurkov, who was the Ukrainian ambassador to Canada, and Mikhailo Vinnytsky, and somebody else. So I had, Groisman, and that was actually something Andrey Kurkov helped me set up. So it was the Ukrainian Prime Minister. So great show. Did the interview with Chrystia Freeland over the phone. And the sound quality wasn't very good because it was over the phone, because that's what Oksana was talking about. It has to be good quality for radio. So we're in there editing with Ihor, and I'm just learning because I don't know how to do this yet. So we're sitting there and he's listening to this and he says, no, this sound quality is terrible. We can't use this interview. And I said, it's Chrystia Freeland. And he said, no, but it doesn't sound right. We can't use this. And I said, no, we have to. And so we took it to Kirill, who was the editor-in-chief. And Kirill was like, no, this is bad sound. I said, Kirill, this is Chrystia Freeland. And he said, oh, okay, well, but only short, because the interview was about, 15 minutes. And he said, okay, just a few minutes, because you're going to lose your audience if you play this bad quality. And so Chrystia Freeland made it into the show, made it into the book. And, but that was one of those things that I had to learn that, you got to make sure the sound quality works in order to make a good show. And I just wanted to give a shout out, Andrei, thank you very much for helping me select the music over the years, but a shout out to Foma, who provided the jingle for the show. Yeah. He needed a signature jingle. And I thought, the stuff I was listening to. So I reached out to him and he sent me a few and I chose one. So if you listen to the show, it's that's Foma. And I also wanted to shout out to a bunch of my students who helped, because this was a total volunteer project. So when I needed help, Larissa Yarovenko was the first one who offered to help. So thank you, Larissa. And then everybody else just stepped up and helped. So my students, they were helping me with the transcribing and all sorts of other things. And it was such a great project. And I would like to see another project like that happen again.
Do you think that something will come down the road similar to your program, or maybe a little bit different? Is it just a matter of people, like you said, it was such a volunteer effort. People get burned out. When people volunteer, they burn out. And then it usually takes, they don't want anything to do with anything similar for many years. They need to step back, but then a new group comes and takes over and does it a little bit differently. I guess this will probably be the final question as we're wrapping up. Do any of you envision something like this in the future, and what would you tweak, maybe do a little bit different if someone or you were to do it again?
I think there will be. One thing that I keep in mind is that a lot of the energy and the drive for this project came from the immediate post-Maidan times, the fact that there was a lot of energy for change in society. And we were picking up on this. And this is something that really kept the project going. Now, things have changed. We're in a pandemic world and everything is somehow much flatter. And not to mention events in Ukraine have changed. But I look with optimism. I think there's nothing quite as sure as change. So I think there will be this wave and the drive to do a project in the future. Thank you.
Andrei, any final thoughts?
Well, people tend to come back to what they did well. Look at Sir Paul McCartney, who issued McCartney 2 after some decades, and then McCartney 3 after some decades, and it again topped the charts. So I think that Oksana and Marta and some other people won't stop at this, and in this or that way, we will be coming back to some good things in their work. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrey. And Marta, final words?
I totally missed doing this show. That was like one of the most fun things I've ever done in my life. Rewarding, interesting. I want to thank everybody who participated in the project, because it was one of those projects that if it wasn't for everybody, it wouldn't have happened, because, you know, I have a full-time job. I'm teaching at a university, but everybody, like so many people, just joined and helped. So that was great. And Hromadske Radio is like this amazing project. So, you know, I keep thinking I would love to do it again, but I don't. I mean, there's lots of people who could do this. So this is, I guess, the request, whoever wants to. And there's also 30 episodes made it into this book, but there's still lots more. So if anybody wants to edit the other ones and do volume 2, because Andreas Umland, he said you could do volume 2, volume 3, you could do all of them. So again, there's lots of work out there. If anybody wants to pick up on it, I would be so happy. And thank you so much, Mirko, for the opportunity to speak about this, because I can't wait to see the book.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all. And thank you for your work in doing this. And you certainly set an example, I think, for somebody in the future to pick this up, and I hope to do. But I am very excited that it did come out in a book format, and that the shows you can listen to them, as Oksana had mentioned. So I encourage everyone to pick up the copy of the book. I guess you can pre-order it now, right? Because it's still being printed. Again, I look forward to using it with my students, and kudos to you. And thank you for sharing your stories. I think we learned a lot about not just the program, but radio and Ukraine and the dynamics of the country and what needs to be done and how it should be done. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And buy the book.
Take care.
By the
Bye-bye.
book.